Our second lesson for this day, our third lesson for this day, comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 1 to 14. Listen with me for God's word to us today. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off your gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast the image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival of the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. Meanwhile, the Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt.' The Lord said to Moses, 'I have seen these people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation.' But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath. Change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. The work of Searight began with an all call over the only radio station that still had a signal in Nicaragua after the earthquake in December of 1972. A shifting of the Earth's plates had devastated the capital city of Managua and left a people already suffering under the deep weight of poverty in even more dire straits throughout the country. At that time, people representing 8 denominations gathered quickly, and within 5 weeks had organized daily distribution or over 3,000 children in the city. In those early days, the goal was primarily emergency relief, and the mission was for 6 months or so. Yet upon arriving at that mark, they knew there was more to be done, and they had learned the power of organizing. With a slight name change that I will not do a disservice to say in my broken, nay, non-existent Spanish, SEPAD shifted from emergency response to development work. Through the Civil War in the 1980s and 90s, SEPAD entered into the work of peace and reconciliation, finding opportunities to foster dialogue between revolutionaries and the government authorities, and was invited to serve as part of the conversations to negotiate disarmament. In the midst of this, they never forgot that at the heart of their mission was the people, particularly the poorest among them. On Wednesday of this past week, Tom Stevenson and I sat in the sanctuary of the First Baptist Church in Managua, where we had traveled to join local leaders and pastors and staff, as well as international partners from the US and the UK, to celebrate the 45th anniversary of SEPAD. 45 years from the incident of their inception, we heard from Psalm 90. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be manifest to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of God be upon us, and prosper for us the work of our hands. Today, SEPAD remains at work alongside the poor in many programs, including sustainable agriculture, economic development for women, psychosocial attention, community organizing and training, strengthening pastoral leadership, refugee resettlement, and exchanges between delegations and partnerships. That last part is where we as SPC come in, or it is where you all came in about 10 years ago with the intro of Tom and Tara Stevenson and with the support of originally of mission co-worker Doug Orbaker, who had come to know 7 communities in the mountainous region just outside of Matagalpa. Since then, many of you have offered your prayers and your financial support. Some of you have made the trip that we made this past week to put faces to names, to stay in homes, to dig latrines and install filters for fresh water, to eat rice and beans and more rice and beans, to learn about these people who, after the commitment of so many of you, we have the great honor to call friends. And do know that they certainly call you friends. It was among these friends that the story of the Israelites and Aaron and of God and Moses, of a mountaintop and a golden calf, and fear and rage and remembrance and hurt and grace lived and spoke in me this week. The Israelites, fresh from slavery in Egypt, they'd seen the seas parted. Miriam had danced and sung with joy. Bread appeared from heaven in just the right measure, and Moses headed up the mountain to talk with God. They'd trekked to this mountain where Moses ascended now almost 40 days ago. We are often shocked that they failed so significantly and in such a relatively quick time. We want to wag our fingers at their impatience and their unfaithfulness. John Bell, who is a member of the Iona community in Scotland, calls this early group the Back to Egypt Brigade. And he uses this term appropriately to reference the fact that the church still today sometimes desires for the assurance of what once was. Egypt was certainly known. In Egypt, it was the case that the devil they knew was better than the one that they did not, and they knew Pharaoh. But what about this God of Moses? Their freedom legs were still not quite under them. Their necks were a bit stiff from trying to not look back. Perhaps I wonder that what the Israelites wanted was not necessarily another God, but certainty, assuredness in the God who had promised them so much that they did not yet see. They wanted certainty that they could see and touch and worship and revel in. Certainty that would allay their fears that this was all just one gigantic, misbegotten mistake. They were a people with no place, with no possessions other than what they could carry, with, it seems, little knowledge of what was happening around them, or if they had any power in the situation at all, and they were afraid. We can certainly understand that. And we know that fear is a heavy burden to carry on a journey. It weighs us down in our hearts and in our minds. It causes us to ask uncomfortable questions, to carry uncomfortable things. It makes us yearn for something, anything that is certain. Certainty can easily serve as a mask for those anxieties that we hold. I think this is the appeal of the dogmatic, and further of the fundamentalist. There are answers in certainty. There is clarity and certainty that first appears to assuage fear, but often we know that it only serves to heighten it. Light is good and dark is bad. We are safe and they are not. God is here, or God is not here. Our desire to rest in easy answers quickly becomes our fault. Our necks grow stiff in certainty that is born of fear. Just look at God further along in this story, almost as if in split screen. God sees the people down that mountain and is enraged. How could they do this? God petulantly asks Moses, the people you brought up from Egypt. God doesn't want to claim them, nor the scarring effect of their short-sighted actions. This is not one of the turn the other cheek lessons that we hear from Jesus. Instead, Moses is invited to pull a Noah and board the next ark, leaving the people to drown in their own apostasy. It is here, I think, that something begins to clarify for me. The relationship between God and the Israelites is not yet fully formed. Surely on God's part, this love was written on the divine heart back to the days of Abraham, yet with the people, there is still time to be spent. There are still assurances to be made, habits to break. And in these still early days, there are missteps, even by God. True relationship takes time. It takes time and it takes grace. So it's been 10 years now that SPC has called friends, the people of the 7 communities outside of Matagalpa. These communities are represented by an association which we came alongside SEPAD in equipping and which we have our deepest relationships. 10 years is quite some time to be in relationship with mission partners, particularly overseas, particularly with the intensity that we have been able to devote. When we talk about developing our relational focus in mission, the good news is that this is not entirely new to us. We've been doing this. In these 10 years, though, this congregation has seen enormous changes, many of these in leadership over the last several years. And these 10 years, likewise, in our partner communities, they have too seen significant changes. Roads have slowly been built up, access to clean water expanded, and leadership, too, has changed. In fact, this was one of our main questions as we met on Thursday morning with Dalila and Francisco and Antonio and Don Valerio. Of the 7 leaders who began this association and drove much of its good work, only 4 sat with us that morning. What was the plan for building back this leadership, we wondered? Could the association continue without it? We were not the only ones who came to this conversation with questions. They came with some as well. Dalila, whom I learned is not one to mince words, spoke from and directly to the heart. Did we still want to be partners? Aside from our most recent trip down in July, communication had been a little spotty. Had we forgotten about them? These were challenging questions on both sides. But as we see between God and Moses, tough questions can be asked in honest relationship. Moses turns to God and says, "Why? Why would your anger burn hot against these your people? Why? Why would you let Egypt think that this was all for evil?" Of course, we had not forgotten our partners, but a season of change here at Swarthmore took a lot of focus. Of course, they wanted to continue on as the association, for there was so much more that they wanted to be done for their community, so much more that they needed. But family and personal struggles and illness taxed the time, and the energy was low. In honest relationship, in deep and meaningful relationship, we can ask the tough questions that help us to grow even more together. I'm happy to share that with assurances that we would renew our energy and Dalila's ability to preach, even to the preacher, about his responsibility to serve as a leader in his community. Our relationship continues, and I trust that it is also quite strengthened. My college roommate at that time, still in training to be a teacher, would come home at least once a week to tell us what had become coveted and hilarious stories of one particular kid. He was a curious kid then, and I hope he still is. Each time she would recount just another way that he used his key phrase, which was, "But why? But why, Miss Allaire? Why do we have to raise our hands? But why, Miss Allaire? Why do you only come on Tuesdays?" Each question to be followed up by another, as most parents of young children are most familiar with. But why? The questions that we ask in relationship to one another ought to be as probing and insistent and earnest. But why would you be so angry with them, God? Asked Moses. But why would you not want us to see you? Asks Israel. What can we do for our people? Asks Sapad. Who will stand up with us? Asks Damila. Being in relationship changes us. This is a gift and a challenge. Whether we are committed to another person, to a congregation, to specific communities of people, and most particularly to God. As Christ's body in the world, the church, we know that we are called to be in relationship and to be changed in it and by it. We know that we are called to be in mission. Fortunately, we have also learned as understandings of what this means, this mission. As these understandings have shifted over time, we have learned that it is important to be in sustained relationship with those who are different from us, who see the world differently from us, who understand God differently from us. This is why we are in mission as much as anything else. For God is revealed in new and wondrous ways through these conversations, and the more that we have in them, and the more questions that we ask, and the more ways that we hold one another in grace, the more we all come to know God in new ways. Just as we are changed, the nature of our relationships change as well. God changed God's mind, and the people were brought near once again. The relationship between God and Israel, between God and the people, between God and the church has shifted and moved and changed and deepened and strengthened over so many years. We give thanks. We give thanks that this is the way that we are called to be with God. And that above all of it, God's love is the most insistent. The most insistent in relationship to us and for our relationships to one another. We know that there is one certainty. In relationship, there can always be, and there always will be, missteps. But we rely on the grace of one another and the grace of God to continue forward. Thanks be to God. Amen.